Ann Klaeysen has served as a leader in the Ethical Culture Society in New York and the Ethical Humanist Society of Long Island. We've had the pleasure of listening to her speak actually at our society as well on a number of occasions, and has worked with the young adult community both on college campuses and within the AEU and the National Leaders Training Council. And it's really a privilege to have her here today. She has served on one or more university campuses in an ethical humanist capacity, chaplain at Adelphi University, the term religious life advisor for her role at Columbia, and spiritual life advisor for her role at New York University. Interestingly, on the population that we're speaking of, the young adults in our world, although the Pew Research Center reports a significant increase in religiously unaffiliated people, also known as the nuns, and young people who identify as spiritual but not religious, there are really only a handful of chaplains on college campuses serving this population. At this point, we really look forward, Anne, to hearing what you have to say about the challenges and your vision and hopes for the future in this next phase. Thank you.
Thank you, Diane. And good morning to all of you at the Riverdale Yonkers Society. It's always a pleasure to speak there. I wish we could be there in person, but I'm sure we will be again soon. And I'm thinking about the children who are celebrating in your physical meeting house this morning. I'd like to open and close with poetry. As a religious humanist, for me, poetry is my scripture. So I begin with a poem by Kurt Vonnegut called Worship. I don't know about you, but I practice a disorganized religion. I belong to an unholy disorder. We call ourselves Our Lady of Perpetual Astonishment. You may have seen us praying for love on sidewalks, outside the better eating establishments in all kinds of weather. Blow us a kiss upon arriving or departing, and we will climax simultaneously. It can be quite a scene, especially if it is raining cats and dogs. So as Diane mentioned, the Pew Forum does a lot of research on the religious landscape in the United States. And for the last decade or so, it's been reporting about an increase in what it refers to as the nuns, the N-O-N-E-S, in other words, having no established religion, and the SBNR, which stands for spiritual but not religious. At NYU, this data is collected. Columbia, unfortunately, does not collect the data for its own reasons. As you'll find out as I continue, each campus has its unique quirks. But NYU collects that data and finds that almost 20% of incoming freshmen are what we call unaffiliated. Now, I want to be clear about this. Even if one is unaffiliated, it doesn't necessarily mean that they weren't raised in a particular tradition or they might not practice it, but they don't consider themselves belonging to an institutionalized religion. So there's some nuance to that data. Well, this morning I'm going to present to you an historical timeline and a current state of the humanist chaplaincies in the United States and in Canada. And I'm going to start by highlighting the first ever university humanist chaplain, Tom Farrick at Harvard, and the latest, Vanessa Gomez-Brake, who is an associate dean of religious life at the University of Southern California. And I'll also tell you about a few of us in between. There are, as Diane said, very few of us. I'll start off with Tom Farrick. The Boston Globe often wrote about Tom Farrick, and they eulogized him after his death on December 30th, 2013. En route from his place at the pulpit as a Roman Catholic parish priest to his tiny basement office in Memorial Church as Harvard University's first humanist chaplain, Tom Farrick set aside beliefs that had provided sustenance after his parents died when he was a child. As he told the Globe in 1973, One doesn't lose faith overnight in the religion that supported him and inspired him through all his mature years. It erodes, I think, by virtue of a keen observation of life and the judgment that no earthly authority can assume so wide a competence as the Catholic Church did. I interject a personal note here. My cousin on my mother's side is a Catholic priest. His name is Father Ed Dillon, and he knew Tom Farrick well because they were both fellow seminarians. And Ed, having followed Tom's transformed vocation, was very familiar with ethical culture. So when I was married in 1982 at the Brooklyn Society for Ethical Culture, I asked Ed to explain to my Irish Catholic mother what I was doing and that it was legitimate. It wasn't enough to hear it from me, but Father Ed had some sway with her. Tom Farrick was slight of frame and so thoughtful and calm that some who met him in his later years couldn't imagine him raising his voice in protest against the Vietnam War in the 1960s. But his word always packed a philosophical wallop. The notion that we all stand in need of redemption is anti-humanist, Tom said. The fact that ordinary human beings are capable of love, compassion, and sacrifice, independent of theology, is proof that we can indeed be good without God. Tom left the priesthood in 1969, and he was for a time a leader of an ethical society, the one in Boston, and then he was a humanist chaplain and lived on an income so modest, it might as well have been a vow of poverty. One day, John Loeb, a wealthy Harvard alumnus, read an article about Tom in the Harvard Gazette and invited him to lunch. They became friends. And when Loeb and his wife donated tens of millions of dollars to the university in the late 1990s, he set aside $800,000 to endow the humanist chaplaincy. It's interesting to note also that that Loeb, there was another graduate from Harvard who knew him well, and Tom liked to tell the story about how he was endowed with $800,000 by John Loeb, but another Harvard graduate, class of 1924, was Corliss Lamont. And some of you may know him because he's one of the founding members in 1941 of the American Humanist Association, and also one of Tom's earliest supporters, albeit not to the tune of $800,000 as Loeb was. It is interesting, though, that Lamont said, "The humanist approach to deeds, not creeds, appeals to me." And he also saw that article in the Harvard Gazette. And the two of them met at their 70th reunion, Loeb and Corliss Lamont. So that was sort of the seed money and the seed inspiration for the start of the very first humanist chaplaincy at Harvard University. Over the years, Tom, of course, had a number of interviews. He told the Harvard Crimson back in 1978, "If your existence ends when you die, you will treasure life more, and you'll try harder to do right and fight for good. You regard this world as something holy." And Tom had grown up, as I mentioned before, as an orphan. He and his sister, Dorothy Cogan, and he spent his early life as a member of the Catholic Church and graduated from Holy Cross College in 1951. And actually, he was a Catholic chaplain at Dartmouth College. So that's how his first chaplaincy was as a Catholic at Dartmouth College, and then he started the humanist chaplaincy at Harvard. He was an openly gay man, and of course, the Catholic Church's position on many social issues, as well as homosexuality and contraception, really led him away from the church. He also worked very closely with other chaplains, his colleagues at Harvard, and his mission was to promote an open religious and humanist discussion at Harvard. He encouraged religious diversity at the university and really reached out to his colleagues there, no matter what their religion. He said, the wonderful thing is that when the United Ministry at Harvard meets and begins to debate different things, say gay rights, we always use the logic and rationality of naturalism. When any chaplain's point of view fails to reach a consensus, he or she has to withdraw that issue and settle for gains in other places. And what an experience it is to test the limits of tolerance and to learn respect for other points of view. It's a living example of what is possible. I often think about that in my settings. A few years ago at Adelphi and now at Columbia and NYU, that we chaplains, religious life advisors, spiritual life advisors, we don't agree on every issue, but somehow we find the common ground and we're able to have that conversation with one another and also appreciate that we are there to present that living example to the students on campus, that we can listen to one another without judgment and we can present that community that we hope that the students will be inspired by. As you probably know, Greg Epstein took over for Tom in 2005. And most of you are probably familiar with Greg. He wrote a book, Good Without God, What a Billion Non-Religious People Come to Believe. And that was a 2010 New York Times bestseller. Probably Riverdale Society, I know the New York Society benefited from that book. Quite a number of people came through our doors because of that. He also started he took over Tom's position in 2005 at Harvard, and he started the Humanist Chaplaincy at MIT. He made a splash the last year or two because he was voted as the head university chaplain at Harvard, a position that Tom Farrick had also held, but social media made a much bigger deal of it. I now want to switch to our latest humanist chaplain, and that's Vanessa Gomez-Brake. She and I are colleagues. We both serve on the advisory council, the Center for Education at the American Humanist Association. And a couple of years ago at the Parliament of the World's Religions, which was held in Toronto, she and I gave a workshop about, guess what, university chaplaincies. She is the Associate Dean of Religious Life at University of Southern California. This is a big deal. She's the first humanist chaplain to serve in this capacity at any American university. In her role, she works to support and promote university religious and spiritual life, and she helps to oversee more than 90, yes, that's 90 student religious groups and 50 religious directors on the campus. She also serves on the Secular Student Alliance and the USC Interfaith Council. Previously, Vanessa worked at Stanford University's Office Religious Life, where she led the campus programming and worked closely with student-led religious groups. She also helped to organize ceremonies, as most of us chaplains do, ceremonies, events, programs, and services. And they were held also at Circle, which is the Center for Interreligious Community Learning and Experiences on the West Coast. And I bring her up because she shows how you can also not only be a religious life advisor, a chaplain, supporting humanism, but you can also be recognized and serve and at the university level as a dean or as associate dean. And as I say, this is a really big deal for those of us who serve in those positions and recognize that you can serve as deans in the university and the academic circles. Here are some of the other chaplaincies, and they include American University, and that's where Chaplain Benjamin Bieber, who's an ordained humanist rabbi, has served for several years. I mentioned that Greg is not only still at Harvard, but also started MIT. Barry Klassel became the humanist chaplain at Rutgers in New Jersey in May of 2009. After being approved by the university's Religious Life Council. Barry, as others are, has a chapter of the American Humanist Association. John Figdor was the first humanist chaplain on the West Coast, and he served in Stanford and he's now the director of the West Coast operations at Ideas Beyond Borders in Mountain View, California. In Toronto, as I mentioned, the Parliament of the World's Religions was held in Toronto back in 2019. The University of Toronto, Mary Beattie, is the humanist chaplain there. And they have a very active group. Also, the founding chaplain was Dr. Gail McCabe. Tufts University also has a humanist chaplaincy, and Ryan Bell is now the humanist chaplain at the University of Southern California. Ryan is interesting because he was formerly with the Secular Students Alliance. That's a typical student group, a typical way for students to become involved with humanist chaplaincies. After nearly 20 years in congregational pastoral ministry, Ryan left his church in 2013 and began to explore both atheism and humanism. He wrote about his experience at the Year Without God block, and his experience in writing became an international phenomenon that was covered by CNN, BBC, NPR. And he then became a writer and a speaker on subjects of religion, humanism, and justice. So this is a way that more people outside of our small circle hear about humanism. When people like Vanessa Gomez break into the academic circles, and when Ryan Bell can reach a larger, indeed an international audience. At Yale, the founding director was Chris Stedman and Kathleen Green. And to get back to my own experience, I interned with Bo Meyerson in 2000. And I started with her actually about a year before that. I got to be on the Columbia campus. And then in 2000, I worked very closely with her. When I was interning at the New York Society in 2001, I kept up that active relationship with Columbia. And then when I went to serve the Long Island Ethical Humanist Society, I served the Adelphi University. An interesting story about Adelphi, how I came to be there. There was a theater professor who was recruited from Harvard to Adelphi. And when he arrived on campus, he asked where the humanist chaplain was because he knew Greg Epstein. They had not heard of this before at Adelphi. And so they reached out to me, and I came in for an interview. The question they had, according to the dean, was the other chaplains were concerned that a humanist would be a religion-hating atheist, and wondered if that was the case with me. When I was able to reassure them that that was not the case, I was brought on and became a colleague there at Adelphi. One of the things I most appreciated about Adelphi was the way that they had integrated us chaplains into the life of the university there, to the extent that we were invited to lead the freshman seminars. Some of you may be familiar with this. When I entered college eons ago, we were all required to read the same book. And that was supposed to sort of get us connected in a way. And then we had these freshman seminars where we would discuss that book. And it was also a way of sort of testing our competency in communication, both written and oral. Well, that tradition still exists on some campuses, and it did at Adelphi, and it would rotate among the different departments. So I was invited to do that. And that was a wonderful way for me to get to know students by leading that freshman seminar at Adelphi. And that's an interesting, I think, a good segue to say, how do we become known on the campuses? It's kind of a catch-22 in a way, because we can be on the campus, but we are not allowed to start student clubs. Only a student group can do that. And that makes sense. We want to empower students to do that. But how do they even know about humanism? And so being allowed to teach a freshman seminar and to introduce myself in that way was a way that I could become known to the students. I am now on Columbia and NYU. In addition to that challenge of how do we become known on a campus if we're not allowed to start a student group, and what if one doesn't exist already, and the nature of students being undergraduates for 4 years and then leaving is how you have to start again from scratch if they have not built up an infrastructure within their club so that it continues. How do you do that? It's become even more trickier with the pandemic when we haven't been meeting in person. When I'm on campus and I'm at a student fair and I'm sitting at a table and I can talk with people, I can reach out more. It's much more difficult when we're meeting on Zoom. NYU has made that a little easier because they have integrated the spiritual life advisors into the university life to a greater extent than Columbia has, so that they had a wonderful program called Radical Health that really helped students during the pandemic with the program of self-care, connecting, relationship building. And as one of the spiritual life advisors, I was invited to be a facilitator for that program. So that was a wonderful way for students to get to know me, because I would have up to 30 students in one of those classes and one of those seminars. As I mentioned earlier, the Secular Student Alliance is a way that we can advise those classes, and that's a separate organization that has a presence on many campuses. As I said earlier, each campus has its unique quirks, but I would say in general, universities expect chaplains, advisors to have been either ordained or certified by their respective organizations and to provide proof of that. You also need to provide recommendations and references. Columbia also provides a certificate of insurance. And I think that's a wise thing to do. You never know what kind of difficulties you might get into. Some university campuses will require a certain number of volunteer hours in addition to advising a student group. So every campus is different. Not all campuses have interfaith centers, but most do. During the 1980s, there was sort of an understanding that all campuses were secular and you didn't need to have these interfaith centers or these religious groups. And then they started doing a little more research and realizing that indeed students did have a need for some spiritual life, for some recognition of this. And they found that, and to address that, many campuses did start to emphasize that more and to offer services, to engage chaplains. Again, in terms of a generalization about university campuses, even if there is, like NYU has the Global Center for Spiritual Life, Columbia has the Office of Religious Life, there will be a paid staff, a dean, an associate dean, but those of us who are chaplains or advisors are volunteer. If we're lucky, our sponsoring organization might pay for it. In my case, well, of course, now I'm retired, so it's entirely volunteer. But when I was a leader at the New York Society included that as part of my contract to be working with Columbia and NYU. And NYU continues to sponsor, or I'm sorry, NYSEC continues to sponsor me and to provide that certificate of insurance. I am the only humanist chaplain from the American Ethical Union. The others are all either from humanistic rabbis or for the American Humanist Association. So what I would like to really emphasize and support and ask for your support is that the American Ethical Union do more. We need to have more support. I urge the American Ethical Union to make this a priority. Right now, as I said, I'm the only one that's endorsed by the AEU and supported by an individual society. NYSEC continues to provide that endorsement and that certificate of insurance. I think it's important that the American Ethical Union do it on a national level. This is something that the American Humanist Association is doing and actually is providing training for that. And I, as part of the advisory council at the AHA, I'm providing that. Indeed, the AHA is very proactively working on university chaplaincies. So part of my, I guess, my marching orders, my takeaway from this platform address is the hope that you will encourage individual societies, but especially the American Ethical Union, to take university chaplaincy very, very seriously. I'm open, if you have a Q&A time afterwards, I'm very happy to discuss this more. But now in closing is a poem by Anne Alexander Bingham, It's called It Is Enough. And again, I consider poetry my humanist scripture, and this poem speaks to me. It is enough to know that the atoms of my body will remain, to think of them rising through the roots of a great oak, to live in leaves, branches, twigs, perhaps to feel the crimson peony, the blue iris, the broccoli, or rest on water, freeze and thaw with the seasons. Some atoms might become a bit of fluff on the wing of a chickadee, to feel the breeze, know the support of air, and some might drift up and up into space, stardust, returning from whence it came. It is enough to know that as long as there is a universe, I am a part of it. Thank you.